Welcome to Wellness Radio with Dr. Jeanette Gallagher as your host. Her show discusses topics of health, wellness, and spirituality, and is about discovering your place in this great universe, from your cells to the cosmos. Along with her guest, in casual conversation, she strives to ask the difficult questions that may be holding you back from a vibrant life, and shares new ideas that may inspire you to make a change in your life that you only can see in your dreams. And now, here is Dr. Jeanette Gallagher.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wellness Radio. This is Dr. Jeanette Gallagher, and it's a pleasure to have you with us here this evening. Tonight we are going to be talking about our history. What has happened in recent years? What needs to be documented? What are the stories? What is the truth? And perhaps what is something we can hold on to in reflection and say, this is an event, this is what happened, this is how it was portrayed. Definitely what we're talking about is the pandemic. Today my guest is Ronald Gruner. Again, his book is The COVID Wars, America's Struggle Over Public Health and Personal Freedom. Truly what this book is about is being able to take all of the information, concisely align it, put it in a documented form, and be able to have something that says, this is how it was reflected in the world. This is how it played out, and this is what's important. Ronald, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate the invitation.
So glad to have you because I think there's so much talk out there, about the pandemic. Even they're still griping about it on social media. They're misconstruing a lot of the information, historical things, and they're saying that this is what it was. And I think there's so much, it's created such an illusion we don't even know what the truth is, perhaps.
Well, that's certainly true. There's a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation circulating through the cable news, the social media, and other channels that thoroughly confused many, many people. And that was a huge problem during the pandemic.
Yeah, because a lot of people were saying, I really don't know what it is. Then, we had a lot of influencers who were talking, a lot of the historical people, your publicists or whatever, everybody was fighting, and they were putting their version out. Do you think that your book is truly about how can we find out what the truer version might be?
Well, that was my objective, and the reader will have to determine that for themselves, but I certainly spent 2.5 years trying to basically document exactly what happened with verifiable facts based on the deaths and economic impact and what medications worked and which ones did not. And being an engineer, our mantra is data drives that speculation, so we try to get accurate data and use that to make decisions.
Yeah, there's so much theory out there these days, and people think that the theory is ending up being the outcome, and then that's going to be the truth. When it's so funny. I talk about it on this show, Ronald, for over a decade now. What is the truth? The truth is only something that one person might believe. There isn't an overall truth. There's just a list of facts, perhaps.
Well, I've got a whole chapter called Alternative Facts, and that's that famous phrase that was coined a few years ago. I'm sure you know the source on that, and that alternative facts is just one person's reality that they're trying to spread and convince other people that's reality. That doesn't make it true, though.
Yeah. You start your book right out in the beginning and you talk about a contagion. There's a lot of viruses, there's a lot of diseases, bacteria that have come across for many decades, even centuries in the world. And as time goes on, the reality is one story. Maybe 10, 20 years later, there's another story written about it. Maybe even a century later, there's another story written about it. Because you're always looking back in reflection through the eyes of today. Do you think perhaps your book starts out as looking to the back and saying, what are the eyes we're looking at it now?
Well, we'll see. I hope so. I mean, one of the things I found interesting and motivated me to write the book is I read several books. I read the discussion of the London Plague of 1665 by Daniel Defoe. He was the author of Robinson Crusoe, the first novel. And his uncle wrote a detailed diary who was living in London at the time in 1665, and he wrote a historical accounting of that. And I was struck by how similar, in many respects, that plague of 1665 were to the 2020 pandemic. And similarly, with the 1918 Spanish flu that killed almost 700,000 people 700,000 Americans. There are many similarities that we see here today, and a lot of misconceptions about what that flu was in 1918. Of course, there was all kinds of misconceptions in 1665 that was understandable. But history tends to repeat itself, or at least echo, that's for sure, and that we're seeing that, and we saw that in 2020, for sure.
Yeah. I think it's in healthcare. I've been in healthcare for over 5 decades now, and I can honestly say that the quest for being able to conquer, to cure, and to treat is really their goal. What can I knock out today so it won't come back again? And definitely, they try that with a lot of diseases and bacteria. They really felt like they had a handle on it. But virus is one thing. They just cannot get a handle on it. It is just obscure. It changes. It seems to morph. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. I mean, look, we still have the common cold and the flu all of these centuries later. So the idea is that when a virus, so to speak, comes up, it really has, I would say people were just running in pandemonium, so to speak. Don't you think?
Yeah, they were. And, part of the problem that you point out is that both bacteria and viruses mutate regularly, and that's why they're a moving target. And that was one of the things I think that caused so much confusion during the 2020 pandemic, is that when the vaccines came out, the vaccines were targeted for a specific early strain of COVID, and that was effective for that. But then by the summer of 21, a new strain had developed, which was even more infectious. And so that was a moving target, and they had to revise the vaccines. And, of course, that happens every year with the flu vaccine because the flu changes year to year. And that's something that's going to be difficult to handle until technology catches up. I think that will with mRNA eventually, when we really get that refined, and we can capture these viruses as they change much more quickly.
But also to the idea is that, is it truly the same name? And I think that's where it's really gotten hung up in all of these eons, is that we keep attaching the word COVID to it, or we keep attaching the word a certain virus to it. We say, oh, well, this is the next version, the next strain, the next this, the next that. When in essence, if it was each called its own entity, treated and diagnosed at that time, then you move on to the next, what's showing up next, with clearer eyes, instead of saying it's a part of. That's where we end up with all of these combination, so to speak, combination vaccines or drugs or whatever you want to call it, whatever it might be. And we end up just like throwing everything against the wall and saying, okay, that seems to work. We're going to scrape it all in a box and give them all of that at once. Don't you think?
Well, somewhat, but COVID is really a family of viruses. COVID, you can think of it as a family, and every strain, the virologists give it a specific name, like H1N1 and H1N5. They all have a specific name, but COVID is kind of the family name. But they've all been one big, large, evolving family. The coronavirus that we call COVID and all the strains, I mean, that evolved from the 1918 Spanish flu virus. So they've been evolving and mutating for centuries, actually, and they'll continue to do so.
Right. Also, too, Ronald, in your book, you really have it right from the beginning, and you start telling the story. I look back in history, and I can't even tell you what I was doing in the year 2000. I mean, unless I pulled out my date book, I couldn't really fathom when it started, when these monumental markers occurred, or when the numbers started to go up, or when the trouble started to be able to even shut us down. Your book is really a collection of walking through that again, which is very important to reflect on, yes?
Yes, I tried to do that. I tried to, provide a history of the pandemic from the medical perspective and how it affected people's their lives medically and economically. But I also try to give background about how the virus evolved, starting with the Spanish flu, the Asiatic flu in the 1950s, and the swine flu in the 70s. So give it perspective, because this had been building over time. And then it hit us like a firestorm in 2020.
Also, too, you talk a lot about public health and personal freedom in your book. People say, well, I'm not free to do what I need to do, but then they had the lockdowns, and then they had a lot of constraints upon our social movement, our financials, and even our health care. You come into the hospital, this is where you're staying, this is how you're going to do it. and you're stuck in this outcome. So I think the idea is that personal freedom was really on the table, number one, and people just really, it took people down, and not just in the U.S. This is a global issue that it really, really affected everybody, yes?
Oh, it definitely did, and some of those sacrifices were necessary to minimize the spread of that. There was a lot of discussion and dissension about how we handled the pandemic, and we made many, many mistakes. And I'd like to say that one of the worst mistakes we made was that the people communicating in the first half of 2020, when the pandemic was really rising, should have had a good course in public relations in terms of how to deal with the public consistently and honestly. And when they make a mistake, say, here's what we said 2 months ago. We said it for the following reasons that was wrong, but here's the new information. And build confidence with people, and that did not happen. So many people lost confidence in what they were hearing from the public health officials in 2020, and that caused a lot of problems. And, of course, nature abhors a vacuum, so social media pundits and cable pundits and other self-made experts had their own opinions, and many people listened to that, which was a serious problem.
Yeah, I think everything that comes along, we have a different set of circumstances. I remember when we went through Hurricane Katrina here, I distinctly remember, standing there and, waving to the guys, on the helicopter, and they just smiled, waved back, and never came back for us. So I think about the idea is that we learned a lot in history and in time and in events, and we're doing the best that we can with the information at the time. At that time, the internet was just starting up. At that time, all of the other storms weren't that bad, and people kind of handled them. And at that time, things weren't disseminated as much. And all of a sudden, now you're starting to put it on the internet, and other people can have a comment or a controversy or, do what they will with the information. So we fast forward to 2000 and 2025, everything is out there. It's fair game, so to speak.
Oh, it is.
So are we really learning or not, do you think?
I'm not sure. I think it's going to take time for us to absorb the lessons of the pandemic. There's just too much emotion involved. I mean, I've talked to a number of people after I published my book across the country, and still people are very, very emotional about it. And people are very upset about the lockdowns and about misinformation, and that emotion clouds their logical thinking. So it's going to take some time for that emotion to wash away and the facts to really come out, I think, unfortunately. But I think we're learning, and a lot of the theories that people were tossing around 3 years ago, you don't hear those anymore.
Also, you talk in the book about vaccines. Boy, is that a hot topic. And, I think you can say the vaccinations, if you really look at it, when my kids grew up in the late 70s and the early 80s, there were very minimal amount of vaccinations that they got. And yet you could fast forward it now, and I'm looking at my grandkids, and I'm going, what the heck happened? How did this slide in under the radar, so to speak? So I think perhaps maybe it was going to come to the catechismic kind of place where we're going to say, hey, what is this happening with vaccinations? I didn't notice. And the people are saying, I didn't notice. And they start to look back in history. Why was it then? And what is this now? So the idea of vaccinations, is it going to change, evolve? Or perhaps maybe we really just need to sit down and look at where we are and figure something out. But your book shows the numbers. This is what it is. This is what it was. This is what it did. And let people form their own opinion?
That was what I tried to do. And the book has a lot of data in it, and that's going to turn some people off. I understand that. The book is 394 pages, and about 120 of those pages are appendices. So for every single state and 20 of the leading countries, I provide a couple of dozen statistics for each state, for example, that is everything from political orientation to median income to vaccination rates to cardiac death rates to COVID death rates. So they can see the data that I use to draw my conclusions from, and they can then confirm that data or not. Now, I'll make a comment about that. As in the United States, I used almost exclusively CDC data, for example, COVID deaths and COVID cases, and people say, well, is CDC reliable? The Centers for Disease Control and Infection. and prevention rather. And I said, well, that data comes from the state, and the state gets it from the over 3,000 county health bureaus. And I did this for about a dozen county health bureaus. You can contact the county health bureaus. Most of the time it's right on their website. You don't have to contact them. Ask them about, for example, COVID death rates in April of 2020, and then check and see what the CDC said. And in every instance, that data was accurate. So I think that data is very accurate, and people that question the COVID death rates just need to do a little bit of homework on that, and I think they'll see that those numbers are correct.
But don't you think, too, Ronald, that all of your data in here is a stepping off stone? In other words, this is what I found at this time. This is what I know as it was reported. Now, it can only go up from there, you know. I mean, pretty much it won't go down from there because there were many people that were not reported. There were many people that didn't put their information in. There were other sources that were collecting information with different parameters. You know, there were other stories and sequestering of information that was kind of being held back. So the idea is that this is the basis that we can draw at this time. And that's what you have to hold on to and say, okay, I get it. At that moment, this is what we have. And as I said in the beginning of the opening, even a century later, we might look at this again and say, hey, it was 6 times that, or it was 3 times that, perhaps.
Well, that may be. I mean, it's a foundation, and it's a pretty good. The book is a pretty good snapshot of the data that was available over the last 18 months. And that data hopefully would be refined and analyzed more and looked at even more accurately over time. But it's a foundation, as I think, the way you should look at it, for sure.
And do you think that some of your information in here, your historical markers, when you talk about the beginning where it really truly started, that was such a controversial topic. So we really have to say, show me the beef, you know? Show me the numbers. Show me what the data you have. Show me where you can follow this thread through. And you took some threads and followed them through. Do you think that in your book, when you shared about the source, it was where we started from?
Well, that's a really interesting question. We don't know the answer to that yet. Let me just chat a little bit about that. As I'm sure you know, there are really 2 theories about where the virus originated. One, and they both were in the same city in China called Wuhan, W-U-H-A-M, which is actually a very large city, 11 million people. Most people had never heard of Wuhan, China until 2020. But one was that it started in a wet market in Wuhan. A wet market is unique to China and Asia, where they sell freshly slaughtered meat, including live animals that are slaughtered in front of the customer because they want to be assured it's fresh. It's something we Westerners are not accustomed to, but it's very, very common in Asia. And there's about 39,000 of those in China. So one theory is it originated in a wet market called the Hunan, Huanan wet market in Wuhan. The other is it originated in the largest and most secure biological research lab, which happened to be in Wuhan also, about 7 miles away from that wet market. So there's no question that it originated, at least today, there's no question that the virus originated in Wuhan, China. One theory is it originated in the market, the other in the laboratory that was known to be conducting research on viruses related to the coronavirus and COVID. What I conclude in my book, now the other thing I point out to people is that a lot of people have theories about where it came from, and they say it came from the lab, but I said, look, I think the place to look is Congress conducted 4 years of investigations, one dominated by Democrats the first 2 years, and one dominated by Republicans the second 2 years. 4 years of total investigations, looking very hard, and many of them wanted to prove it came in one place or the other. Neither one was able to do that. They both concluded after 4 years of investigation, Congress did, that we don't know exactly where it came from, where it came from at this point. There's suspicions. Now, the way I kind of summarize that, Doctor, is I'm an engineer and I look at it statistically. There are 39,000 wet markets in China. There was one highest level security biology lab, which happened to be in Wuhan, 7 miles from the wet market they think it may have come from, as one alternative. The probability of it coming from a wet market that happened to be in the same city 7 miles away, when there's 39,000 wet markets in China, is vanishingly small. So statistically, it seems almost impossible that it came from the wet market that happened to be by that laboratory, if you follow my reasoning on that. So I don't know, but it seems to me, statistically, the laboratory is very, very suspicious. But that's all I can say. I'm not trying to start a conspiracy theory. I'm just looking at the numbers.
Yeah, and that's what we needed to do, is just to look at where did the thread start, how did it play out, and then we'll look back at it again later in reflection when more information becomes available. Also, too, I think, Ron, the idea is that we looked at definitely about the virus and how viruses work, and we also looked at, possibly the origination and the data. Let's also talk about and we talked about freedom, too. Let's talk about the idea of the political climate. The political climate you did outline and put a thread through your book about the political climate at the time, because were we truly fighting the disease, our freedom, or the politics at the time? Those are three big players, yes?
Yes, they were, and we were fighting ourselves much of the time, unfortunately, and that was one of my biggest personal disappointments. As an engineer, I wanted to understand, what most closely correlates with predict, say, for example, COVID death rates? Would it be personal income, education level, levels of obesity? So I was trying to find factors which would tend to correlate or tend to predict death rates, which suggest they were possible causes. So areas might be things like personal income or education level or obesity levels, for example. But the strongest predictor of who lived and who died in a particular county or in a state or even a city, and I looked at all three levels, unfortunately, was political orientation. And the bottom line, and I discussed this in my book extensively, is that strongly Democratic areas, let's talk counties, strongly Democratic counties had lower COVID death rates than strongly Republican counties, but also had a more serious economic impact than Republican counties. So more deaths less deaths in Republican counties, in Democratic counties, less deaths in Democratic counties, but more unemployment, and just the opposite for Republican counties, where you had higher deaths but less employment. So there was kind of a trade-off between economic impact and health impact, between political orientation.
I live here in Louisiana, and, I've lived in New Orleans for decades, and you put the statistics down for Louisiana, and I distinctly remember it at the time. People were, definitely in the beginning, they were kind of like, panicked, but then it kind of like wore off pretty quick. Pretty much people were, hey, we're outside 95% of the time. It's going to be no big deal. You have something going on inside, just put your chair outside and you're good to go. So we were pretty much not restricted by a lot of the parameters that other people were in other states or in other countries. We just kind of like flew with it, Most of our food, you can get your seafood from the Gulf. You don't have to worry about the grocery store. You can plant what you want. It grows all year round here. We were kind of knew our self-sufficiency, so to speak, especially being after hurricanes. We can take care of ourselves. We're good to go. Leave it alone.
I know you've seen much worse. You've seen very, very serious catastrophes, including Katrina, for example. But no, you're right. Going outside and going to the beach and practicing social distancing and not talking to each other 2 feet apart was good judgment. And I mentioned the Mardi Gras in my book in Louisiana, and there was, as you saw in the book, a spike in Louisiana and nearby Mississippi within a few weeks of the Mardi Gras. That was a relatively small spike. I'm not saying that disrespectfully, but relatively small. A much larger one I also discussed happened about 6 months later in August of 2020 during the Sturgis motorcycle rally in the Dakotas. And there you saw a much, much larger spike in death rates. And it turned out that North and South Dakota had the highest death rates in the United States in the second half of 2020. Yeah. And that's because you had almost 500,000 motorcyclists hanging out together, not 6 feet apart, but in bars and all kinds of places. And there was no question it increased the death rates.
Yeah, it truly was about what are you able to look at when the next pandemic comes. Are you a survivalist? Are you able to take care of yourself? Are you able to disseminate some of the information? And are you able to say, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to use my best judgment? I think perhaps maybe we are becoming a little bit more intuitive, so to speak, as humans, I would hope. but there'll still be a large amount of the population who is still dependent upon the idea of, fix it, what are you going to do for me? The government's got it all taken care of, perhaps?
Well, I'm not sure of that. Unfortunately, here in the United States, the trust in the government's declined since 1964 pretty steadily, and it's at an all-time low right now. And what I say to people, if and when another pandemic comes, and one surely will, my advice, and you've been in medicine for 50 years, my advice is to first go to your personal physician and get his or her advice and listen to that carefully. And then if you want additional background, don't go to the web, don't go to social media, don't go to cable news. We've got some of the best medical institutions in the country. We have the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. We have Massachusetts General in Boston. We have Tulane down in Louisiana. We have Stanford. We have all the Cleveland Clinic. Go to those institutions and see what they say. And if they say vaccines work, believe it. If they say you should social distance, believe it. Don't try to second guess that. That's my advice if and when the next pandemic comes.
Yeah, I think the idea is that we will be hit, like just as sure as, hurricane season comes every year, we will get it again. And we're kind of, it's almost like after the event, people tend to migrate. I'm going to go to this state because they did better. I'm going to go to that state because it's better. People come here because they want to help and they might stay or whatever, or then they leave. It's sort of like, y'all, just stay in your own area. No, we don't want you here. You know what I mean? Because you end up, just as you said about with the Sturgis and stuff, you have people from outside the area bringing things in, bringing their own beliefs, their thoughts, and their truths, and making them into ours, that we should follow their own beliefs, truths, and things. Just as well as in the U.S., if something occurs in the U.S., you don't want to take that piece of information, that government, and misconstrue it into another country or another locale or whatever, because it isn't theirs. I think that's so vitally important, too. When things come along and happen, they are very localized. And I think you see that in your book, yes?
Well, I think I do. And, of course, like we talked about in the case of the Mardi Gras, in the case of the Sturgis motorcycle rally, you had thousands and thousands of people coming into a particular area and bringing their own values. And, I'm a motorcyclist myself. I ride a Harley. And so a lot of us motorcyclists are very, very independent. And they brought that notion of independence and kind of fearlessness, because they're riding a motorcycle across the country at 70 miles an hour. So, they're not too worried about some of these things. I can say that myself because I do ride a motorcycle. But they brought values into North Dakota and South Dakota that unfortunately hurt a lot of people.
Yeah. So that's really how things and ideas spread. That's how information, data gets spread. That's how information and misinformation gets spread and ends up becoming the truth. When people came here and they started to help us rebuild, they said, we know how to build. We build a house in Wisconsin. We're good to go. Well, you use the wood that you would use in Wisconsin. You use the techniques you used in Wisconsin, and you brought them here. We have 80% humidity the entire year round. We don't seal up our houses. We leave breezeways and everything to be able to get the air to flow through. And we live with mold and algae all the time. We're good to go. So it really caused a lot of problems where those houses were actually, now we are almost, 25 years now? No, 20 years now? Those houses have all broken down and deteriorated. They can't withstand the test of time. So the idea is that when you bring an idea and information in, it will wither if it isn't going to uphold in the area in which it is being utilized. It will deteriorate.
Well, that's a good point. And a lot of times that information that's coming in may not really be accurate or relevant for your environment. Like you point out, you've got a very high humidity, and that humidity breeds fungus and mold, which you don't have in Arizona because it's so low humidity. It's a whole different situation. Yeah. Another thing, Doctor, I mentioned is on social media and cable. I mean, in cable news, you've got people are worried about ratings. They got to keep the ratings up. And I have a small Substack where this is like a blog, and every time I put it out once a week, and you watch the attendance level and the interest level, and so it's very tempting to say, okay, I've got to change my story to get more interest out there, and you could actually stretch the truth, say, or put stuff out you think would be interesting and gather a larger crowd. So people have to be aware that people that are listening to on social media and the cable news, they're focused on ratings or growing their audience. And sometimes that's not the best way to get to the truth.
Oh, absolutely, Ronald. I'm so glad you said that. You know, like I said, I've been doing this radio show for almost 20 years, and I will tell you, people will ask for my numbers. I say, I have no idea. All I know is I'm putting out the information, and I'm doing it of my free will and my freedom, and I enjoy the book, and I have a conversation. And I think that's truly how you can disseminate the correct information for yourself and for the time. Yes?
Oh, that is so healthy. That is so, you're so right on it. You basically saying, I have a message to get out, and I'm going to give that message, and people can listen to it, accept it or reject it, but I'm not going to change my message to get more people. And, we're just an observation. I'm old enough to remember the news during the 50s and 60s, Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley, and those, there were only, at the time, only three broadcasters, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and they operated their news operations at a loss because those people were not constrained to try to build ratings. They tried to just get out the most accurate information possible. And for the most part, they were highly, highly trusted, people like Walter Cronkite. That's not the case now. The case is they've got to build an audience and get that audience as large and as loyal as possible. And that means tailoring the message oftentimes, which is a big, big problem here in the United States and worldwide. But your comment about, what you just said is, I have a message to get out, and I'm going to get that out. I don't know what the ratings are. I don't know who's listening. That is really, really healthy. Yeah.
And I think also, too, Ronald, in closing, we wanted to touch on this, is that when you use this thing, COVID wars, what you're doing is you're saying COVID was a war of freedom, of the political system, of the health of people in themselves, in their outward way in which they lived, and it also caused them to have a war within themselves. So really, truly, what this virus did is it shattered life as we knew it and said, hey, I'm going to stand right here because you know what, everything you knew is going to change. And it's almost as if the virus has pulled the plug on our existence and our reality, and it was like just standing there waiting to see what was going to happen to humanity. And I'm not sure that humanity's gotten any better. How about you?
Well, like I've said, it's going to take time for us to learn and absorb it, and hopefully we will. But it was a war. I mean, we lost more people than COVID. Now it's 1.2 million have died of COVID. Almost three times the number of deaths in World War II. World War II was a huge trauma for the United States, but COVID killed three times more at this stage. Of course, we had more population in the United States, but it was still extremely serious. And I think the reason we were so divided is in World War II, we had an external enemy we could all focus on, Germany and Japan. In COVID, the enemy was really internal, and it was much, much harder for us to focus on it.
Yeah. It really took a really deep dive into mental health, too. It blew it to smithereens, the idea of, I have to go to work every day. I have to do it because I have to this. I have to do it because I have to survive. So I think the idea of our safety and security in all realms really was blown up, don't you think?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it put tremendous societal, disruption on people and pressure. And as you know from the book, deaths of despair from drugs and alcohol climbed, very significantly. Not just in the lockdown states, but in all states. That was another thing I found surprising, in that the number of deaths of despair, for example, from drugs, were kind of went up in all states, whether they were locked down or not. It was the disruption of COVID and the deaths that resulted in families, in relatives, and friends that caused a lot of those issues.
I think we're still on the slippery slide of perhaps a monumental peak about debt and financial disruption. Since the pandemic, everything's just been going straight up. And I think probably our next pandemic, endemic, whatever you want to call it, give it whatever word you want, but it's going to be when that plug will get pulled. And perhaps when everything falls, then we'll be able to figure out what survival is about, you know. And I always talk about that on the show because I think so many people really don't have any idea. It's not about stockpiling, 100 pounds of rice and beans and all these MREs and all that other stuff in your closet. It's about being able to say, I'm going to be okay for what I've got today. And I think that's truly what we're really saying. This is what the COVID wars were about. This is how we experienced it. Where are we today? Form our own truths and our beliefs and move on, perhaps? I
hope so. I think people are looking more introspectively at it, but like I point out in my book, I think there's not a strong appetite for looking at COVID and understanding it. And I can just say, my book's been out for a few weeks now, and it's the sales, I'm being frank with you, are relatively slow because I think it's going to take a while for people to really come back and say, I want to understand more about this. And I acknowledge that in my introduction, saying it's going to take a while, and I understand that. But hopefully when people do come back, like I said earlier, much of the emotion will be washed out, and they can look at things objectively. And we'll all learn from it as a society.
Because so many people, like here in Louisiana, the newspapers went away, in so many areas. You were just stuck with the internet, and who even can figure out half the time what that thing says, So, and a lot of people cut their cord. They don't have cable TV anymore. They're streaming, so they're sort of like, I don't want to know what goes on in the outside world, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's a shame we all the big, the great big, large city newspapers are going away very, very quickly, which is a shame. And it's all being driven by advertising now.
Yeah, I haven't seen the newspaper since I don't know when, and we cut the cord, so it's sort of like, I don't know what's going on out there,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I still get a paper subscription to the Wall Street Journal and read that. Mm-hmm. And that still arrives in my driveway every morning. But
oh wow,
it's not inexpensive. It's expensive to get it, so I can see why people are dropping it. But news, there's so many sources of news. People can pick and choose what they want to hear, and confirmation bias is deadly. If people have an idea, then they'll oftentimes look for sources that reinforce that idea rather than challenge it.
Yes.
And what you really want to do, if you've got a strong idea about something, you look for areas that challenge that idea rather than reinforce it.
Absolutely. I had a show, I'll just say this in closing, but I had a show the other day, and we were talking about, I don't know what we were talking about. At any rate, we were saying about people are always looking to go with the flow, to be able to be in coherence and, stay together, and this is how everybody's going to be supported, and the world will go on. And I'm going, oh, no, heck no. I'm the one that's going the opposite way, coming in and bumping into everybody, because in that way, what I'm doing, each time I bump into and I say, oh, you didn't think about this. Ooh, that's a problem there. Oh, you didn't pay attention to this. So I will come in from the back end on almost anything and be able to say, wake up, what you think isn't, perhaps.
Well, that is really good. Every society needs thoughtful contrarians. And it's a thoughtful contrarians that really keep us on the right track.
Absolutely. It's the funniest thing. I could sit here and I could read a 400 or 500 page book in like 2 hours because I speed read pretty well. But anyway, I will be the first one to pick up if there's a mistake in type, and I'm going, whoops. And they're saying this 500 pages, and in 2 hours you find 3 mistakes. I say, I don't know, it just showed up.
Well, I've got a challenge for you. In the book that you've got, I know that at least there's one spot where there's a period instead of a comma.
Oh, okay. Probably, yes.
Yeah, no, there's supposed to be a comma there, and it escaped all the proofreaders, and I just noticed it myself a few days ago. And
Isn't
so it's
funny?
but you'll have a hard time spotting that, I guarantee you.
Isn't it interesting? But that's about how we should look at the world, Ronald, and I think that's important. You should be looking at the world like that, instead of always being one going along with everything else. Because what's the point of just flowing in the world? You want to feel yourself. You want to know when you're hurt. You want to know when something's right or wrong. You want to know when it challenges you. What's the point of it otherwise, perhaps?
Well, I think that's the minority, to be frank with you. I think most people are social animals and really appreciate the social relationships and want to have a relatively smooth relationship among their peers and their family. And but others kind of question things, and like I said, are contrarians, and I think that's healthy. Yeah, everybody can't be a contrarian because then you'd have havoc.
You'd have chaos.
You have chaos, but you do need a certain number of people that are willing to question things and have the courage to stand up and say, I'm not sure that's true, or let's look at this, as opposed to agreeing with the group.
Absolutely. Well, I have kids, and my kids have all been taught to be contrarians. My one daughter is an ER physician. My one son, he works with crisis kids in really dangerous situations in California. And my other one, he climbs up light poles, and he works for the electric company. So we've all been taught to be able to see those things from the other side. So I think that's really kind of cool.
Well, that's wonderful. You can be very proud of that. Very proud of that. But I have a similar thing. I have nurses all to my family. My wife was a nurse for 22 years in Boston. My mother was a nurse. My daughter's a nurse. I have 3 sister-in-laws that are nurses. Those are the ones I can think of right now.
Yes, they all know how to nurture. Isn't that wonderful?
They're wonderful people. They're God's angels on earth.
Yep. To know how to nurture the heart is what it's all about. Yep.
Yes, that's true.
Awesome. Oh, well, Ronald, it was such a pleasure to speak with you today. I'm so glad we connected. Can you share with the listeners how to find out more information about your work?
Well, the name of the book is COVID Wars by Ronald Gruner, and you can get that at any bookstore. And if they don't have it in stock yet, they ask them to order it. They can order it very easily, and you'll have it in a few days. Or go online. Obviously, Amazon has it, Barnes & Noble has it online, Apple has it online. So your favorite online dealer would have it, and that's the way to get it in 2 or 3 days. But it's COVID Wars, available pretty much everywhere.
Very good. Well, Ronald, it was a pleasure to have you with us here today, because I think that in reflection, that even this conversation, we'll probably take this and listen to it in 5 years and say, holy smokes, look at what we thought. we were kind of the forerunners. We kind of shed the light and be able to say this is what they should look at, yes?
Well, time will tell. I hope you're right. I think you are.
Thank you. If you'd like to find out more information about Ronald Gruner, again, the book is COVID Wars, America's Struggle Over Public Health and Personal Freedom. Please do click on the link on the bottom of today's show page to go directly to his website for more information. And it is about being able to say what is in front of you, be able to stop for a moment, pull the plug, so to speak, see how it affects you, see what's going on out there, and perhaps see what's coming up on the inside. It truly is about being able to say how we're all going to navigate this world, and it's definitely going to be showing up again in the near future. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Dr. Jeanette Gallagher, and until tomorrow, have a great day.
Today we discussed many life-changing concepts. Who do you turn to, and how do you know what is best when faced with a health crisis? Dr. Jeanette is a patient advocate. She listens to the patient, the doctors, and the family, clarifies the health issues and concerns, then helps the patient make the best choices going forward. If you would like help implementing change into your life and health, we can talk and see where you are stuck and how to improve the quality of your life. Check the link on the bottom of today's show page or visit drjeanettegallagher.com to schedule a phone appointment today.